It was a cold winter afternoon in 1968 when a Soviet submarine captain struggled to contain his anger. His second-in-command had just reported to sailors. Caught dozing off at their posts on a submarine armed with 3 nuclear missiles. The implications were grave. One moment of negligence could end millions of lives. Furious, the captain harshly reprimanded the men and reassigned them to kitchen duty. As he moved through the narrow, dimly lit corridors of submarine K-129, he passed by exhausted sailors. The atmosphere was thick with fatigue. The 98 men aboard had been at sea for nearly 2 weeks, long past when they were supposed to return to shore, but due to mechanical failures on other vessels, K-129 had been ordered to fill the gap in the Soviet Union's Pacific Defense Line. Morale was crumbling. Even the 38-year-old captain, a seasoned officer, felt the toll. Upon reaching his cramped quarters, he sat down heavily and unbuttoned his uniform shirt. Catching a glimpse of himself in the mirror, he noticed the fatigue etched into his features, bloodshot eyes, drawn expression, slumped shoulders. The burden of commanding a nuclear-armed submarine was written all over him. He lay down, resting his head on a worn pillow. Over the years, he had trained himself to fall asleep quickly, taking brief naps to recharge between duties. As his eyes closed and he began to drift off, a sudden, violent noise jolted him awake. It was an enormous, thunderous bang. Before he could fully register what had happened, screams echoed down the hallways. Alarms screamed. Emergency lights bathed the narrow passages in a red hue. Sailors were sprinting in all directions, confusion and fear in their eyes. The submarine tilted, throwing the captain off balance. He clung to a handrail. As his ears popped, he knew immediately what that meant. The pressure was changing rapidly. The submarine was descending. Water appeared, rushing through the sub like a living beast. A massive wall of it surged toward him, swallowing everything in its path. He looked up, eyes locking onto the ladder leading to the bridge of the command center. That was where he should have been, but the route was blocked. There was no escape, no way out. K-129 was sinking. In March of 1968, a Soviet nuclear submarine named K-129 sank in the vast Pacific Ocean about 1,500 miles northwest of Hawaii. It happened in the heart of the Cold War, a time when tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union were at a boiling point. The sinking of a nuclear submarine was not just a tragic accident, it was a crisis. Weapons of mass destruction were now lying at the bottom of the ocean, unprotected. Sensitive state secrets were potentially up for grabs to whoever could get to them first. As both superpowers scrambled to respond, the Americans got there first. Using advanced sonar, they identified the exact resting place of K-129. What followed was one of the most secretive and ambitious covert operations in U.S. history, a mission to recover a 2,700-ton Soviet submarine from nearly 16,000 feet below the ocean surface without alerting anyone, especially the Soviets. This impossible operation would bring together an unlikely group of players, elite spies, world-class naval engineers, and even a flamboyant Hollywood mogul. With a staggering $800 million budget and access to the best minds in the country, the U.S. launched a classified mission like no other. But would they succeed in lifting the submarine without the world knowing? What secrets did K-129 hold deep beneath the waves? And if recovered, would the American public ever learn the truth? At the U.S. Naval Observatory in Washington, D.C., in late May of 1968, John Craven sat quietly, lost in thought. He tapped a pen against his head, eyes closed, absorbed in complex calculations. Suddenly, his eyes flew open. "It's in one piece," he exclaimed aloud, though no one was around to hear him. Craven led the Navy's Deep Submergence Systems Project, an initiative focused on recovering materials from the ocean floor. At just 40 years old, He was already among the top experts in undersea recovery in the U.S. Navy when he learned that the Soviets had dispatched a vast fleet of submarines, ships, and even fishing vessels into the Pacific. He had a hunch. They were searching for something, and Craven thought he knew exactly what: the sunken submarine K-129. Despite the Soviet efforts, it seemed they hadn't located the wreck. In recent days, it looked like they had scaled back their search. But what they didn't know, what only a handful of American officials knew, was that U.S. sonar systems had already identified the precise resting spot of K-129, nearly 3 miles beneath the surface. It sat there in silence, its secrets sealed in a metal coffin. Initially, Craven had not been optimistic. Submarine that suffered a catastrophic explosion likely wouldn't offer much value. And as it sank, the overwhelming pressure would have crushed it, completely destroying anything useful inside. But the sonar data suggested something different. It looked like the sub had exploded while still on the surface, and afterward, there was no recorded implosion, no collapse as it descended. That could mean the submarine remained intact. On his notepad, Craven scribbled 2 electrifying words: K-129, intact. Then he reached for the phone. In downtown Los Angeles, 4 young engineers stood in a cluttered office, staring in confusion. They had been listening to an explanation about offshore drilling technology, but seemed completely lost. Kurt Crook, the man explaining, realized he needed to simplify. Crook was 41, the head of engineering at Global Marina Company, known for creating some of the most advanced ocean drilling ships ever made. His office door was rarely closed. He was known for solving impossible problems and getting the job done. Just as he was about to rephrase his explanation, the intercom buzzed. His secretary said a man had called multiple times, refusing to leave his name, but insisting it was urgent. Crook, a little annoyed, told her to schedule the call for later. Then the intercom buzzed again. This time her voice was different, nervous. The same man had just walked into the building with 2 others. None would identify themselves. Before Crook could react, the 3 strangers entered his office, calm and confident. They wore polished business suits and carried themselves like men on a mission. The one in front introduced himself as John Parangoski. Most people called him JP. He claimed to work for the CIA. Crook asked for identification. JP smiled and said they didn't carry ID. Crook wasn't convinced, but something about their presence made him believe they were legit. JP got straight to the point. The CIA needed Crook's help with a top-secret mission. He needed to know, could his company lift an object weighing 2,000 tons from 3 miles beneath the ocean? Crook's first instinct was uncertainty. He had never done anything like that before. JP thanked him and said they'd be in touch. That night, Crook couldn't sleep. The question swirled in his mind. 2,000 tons. 4 million pounds. What kind of object were they talking about? It had to be a submarine. The Navy had previously approached Global Marine about similar ideas, so the thought wasn't far-fetched. And if any company could pull it off, maybe it was his. The concept never moved beyond theory. The job eventually went to another firm, possibly one that wasn't even American. Curtis Crook stood before a shelf, scanning it until his eyes landed on a slim book with a blue cover. It was a reference manual revered in naval circles as the Bible for maritime warfare. Inside were technical details on naval ships and submarines from all over the world. Flipping through its pages, Crook found the section he was searching for: Soviet submarines. The specifications listed there aligned almost perfectly. By the following day, Crook was back in the office, still consumed by the thought, could they actually retrieve a submarine from the ocean floor? His intercom buzzed. He already knew who it was. JP from the CIA entered, flanked by 2 familiar agents, more relaxed this time. With a faint smirk, Crook looked up and said what they'd been waiting to hear. I think it can be done. It was mid-November, 1969. Just a week after his initial meeting with JP, Crook found himself sitting inside a small, windowless room near Los Angeles International Airport. The place was dull, airless, and tightly secured with keypad locks. Crook had officially been brought onto the top-secret K-129 project. The CIA had kept the matter under strict confidentiality, and in turn, Crook had recruited just 2 engineers he trusted. Now, the trio gathered in that quiet room to examine a project that sounded impossible. As Crook had suspected, the CIA's plan was to recover a sunken Soviet submarine K-129 to help visualize the challenge. JP handed over a green binder filled with the agency's proposed recovery concepts. As Crook flipped through the CIA's collection of ideas, he and his engineers couldn't help but laugh. Some proposals seemed utterly absurd. One involved the use of rockets, another relied on robotic arms, and yet another proposed buoyant flotation bags to raise the sub to the surface. At one point, one of Crook's engineers theatrically threw his hands in the air in disbelief. Were these people serious? None of the ideas in the Green Book held water literally or figuratively. But over several brainstorming sessions, Crook and his engineers devised a concept they believed could succeed. Called it the deadlift method. The idea: construct a long, heavy pipe longer than anything previously engineered. Attached at the end would be a massive mechanical claw designed to grasp the submarine from the seabed and lift it to the surface. Even when Crook first described it out loud, it sounded like something pulled from a child's imagination, but he knew it was feasible. He took a sip of coffee and glanced at the rough sketch he had made of the claw. It looked ridiculous, more like a science fiction fantasy than a real engineering solution. But it was going to be real. That claw was only one piece of the puzzle. To raise the K-129, they would also need a ship-hand enormous one. Not just any vessel, but something akin to a man-made island floating on the sea. A ship of this scale had never been built before. Crook stood up and addressed his small team. There was another layer to this. The operation had to be kept completely secret. It was vital that the Soviets, and even the American public, never suspected the ship's real purpose. They needed to cover a story, and a believable one. One engineer asked the obvious question: how do you hide a $350 million, 600-foot-long ship sitting in the middle of the Pacific? Crook had an answer. 2 simple words: deep sea mining. By 1969, deep-sea mining had moved from science fiction into a growing industrial reality. Companies were investing heavily in the idea of extracting valuable metals like copper and nickel from the ocean floor. So if the U.S. claimed to be building a high-tech, expensive vessel for mining operations, it wouldn't raise too many eyebrows. The cover story was solid. Crook sighed. That was the easy part. Now they had to actually build it. On a scorching summer day in 1970, Curtis Crook met a colleague for coffee at a modest diner near Global Marine's headquarters. Across from him sat John Graham, the company's chief naval architect. At 55, the MIT graduate was one of the sharpest minds in the business, known for designing groundbreaking ships like the Challenger, a vessel that could drill at depths of 20,000 feet. When Graham spoke, others listened. But today, cigarette balanced between his fingers, he simply listened as Crook made his pitch. Crook needed a ship one even larger than the Challenger. How much larger? Graham asked. Crook paused, knowing he couldn't give Graham the full truth. The CIA had refused to grant him clearance because of his past struggles with alcoholism. Though Graham had been sober for years, the agency still considered him a potential security risk. Crook gave a partial answer. He said he wanted a ship that weighed 35,000 tons, 3 times the size of the Challenger, and he needed it to feature an enormous opening in the center, at least 125 feet long, maybe more. Lighting another cigarette, Graham gave a skeptical laugh. This sounds like a boondoggle. How do you make money from a ship like that? Crook brushed the question aside, saying that well-funded investors were eager to dive into deep-sea mining. Let him handle the finances. In the months that followed, Graham got to work. Though the project remained classified, even within the company, he was permitted to recruit a few engineers to assist. He spent countless late nights hunched over drawings, using a plastic slide ruler while jazz and big band music played softly in the background. Then, in October 1970, Graham's security clearance finally came through. Now, Crook could reveal the real reason behind the ship's enormous design. Once Graham and the rest of the team learned the vessel's true purpose to lift a sunken Soviet submarine, they realized they needed to make it even bigger. Over the following months, the ship's planned weight increased from 33,000 to 50,000 tons. The central opening, called the moon pool, was expanded from 125 feet to 199 feet. And then there was the claw, the mechanical claw, designed to retrieve K-129, had to resemble a toy claw machine, complete with multiple gripping fingers, sonar devices, and video cameras to pinpoint the sub's exact location. It also needed to have strong mechanical legs to support the lift. This was no arcade game. The pressure was real, and the timeline was tight. There was no room for error. Crook brought in a meticulous engineer to monitor Graham's work, ensuring that every aspect of the ship's design could actually be built or would soon be possible. With each passing day, the plans took shape. The ship was no longer a theory, it was becoming reality. Crook faced a new challenge: how to explain why a floating island-sized vessel was being constructed in the Pacific Ocean. That's where Howard Hughes came in. In early December 1970, Crook rode the elevator to the penthouse suite of a high-rise Los Angeles hotel. At the door, he was searched by two muscular security guards before being allowed in. Inside, seated around an elegant glass table, were representatives from Global Marine, the CIA, and a lawyer from Hughes Tool Company. Crook sat down nervously. He had butterflies in his stomach. This meeting went sideways. He would be held responsibly, had been his suggestion to involve one of the most unpredictable men alive. Howard Hughes, a billionaire recluse, was a gamble Crook was willing to take. Howard Hughes was the perfect cover for Crook's wild plan. Not only did Hughes have a long-standing reputation in the mining and drilling industries, but Global Marine had already been purchasing drilling equipment from his company, Hughes Tool, for years. The billionaire was infamous for his appetite for risky ventures. So, if someone told the world he was investing in an audacious deep-sea mining project, no one would raise an eyebrow. In fact, it would seem entirely in character. But there was a complication. Hughes was notoriously eccentric. He rarely appeared in public, and his behavior bordered on the bizarre. Once, he told his staff he was heading out to catch a movie. Then he vanished into a screening room and didn't re-emerge for 4 months. When he finally came out, he was still wearing the same stained, unwashed clothes he had on when he went in. At the pivotal meeting where the proposal was pitched, Hughes didn't attend in person. Instead, his lawyer showed up on his behalf. Yet something strange was happening. Throughout the meeting, the lawyer kept receiving mysterious phone calls. He'd listen silently for a few seconds, hang up, and then ask a new question, as though he were being directed in real time. Crook was certain Hughes was somewhere in the building, listening in on the meeting and giving instructions over the phone. Whatever Hughes heard must have impressed him. By the end of that meeting, he agreed to serve as the face of the CIA's secret endeavor, funneling funds through his name and Global Marine to build the massive recovery vessel. Now, the fate of this enormous operation rested in the hands of one of the most unpredictable men on the planet. Just days after Hughes agreed to play his role in the covert operation known as Project Azorian, Crook found himself standing in another penthouse, this time in Hawaii. It was December 8th, 1970, and the occasion was the official announcement of Global Marine's supposed deep-sea mining venture. The penthouse had been transformed into a press conference hall. Reporters and stakeholders filled the room, holding champagne flutes and buzzing with curiosity. Crook stepped up to the microphone and tapped it to test the sound. As he gazed at the crowd before him, he confirmed what many had speculated. Global Marine was launching a bold new initiative. It involved an unprecedented ship, revolutionary technology, and mining rare earth minerals from the ocean floor, all bankrolled by none other than Howard Hughes. Then, the president of Hughes Tool took the mic and revealed that Hughes had been behind the project from the beginning. Together with Global Marine, Hughes would finance a cutting-edge vessel designed to tap into the ocean's untapped resources. The ship would be named the Hughes Glomar Explorer. The room erupted in applause. Fast forward to January 2nd, 1974. The Hughes Glomar Explorer, fully constructed and brimming with the most advanced tech ever put to sea, was finally launched off the coast of California. Nearly 6 years had passed since the Soviet submarine K-129 had sunk. Now, the CIA finally had a ship capable of retrieving it. At 619 feet long, with 3 towering metallic structures rising from its deck, the Explorer looked less like a mining vessel and more like a floating industrial factory. But the weather was unforgiving. High winds and turbulent waves made for an unstable maiden voyage. Under any other circumstances, they might have delayed the test, but they were under pressure. The mission had to be completed by summer. Crook stood by the railing above a massive opening in the ship called the Moon Pool. Beneath it were enormous steel gates designed to keep the ocean at bay until the crew was ready. In the control room, someone hit the switch to open the gates. Water surged into the moon pool, but the ship's motion caused it to splash onto the deck, drenching the observers. Meanwhile, the steel gates below slammed repeatedly into the hull, sending thunderous echoes throughout the vessel. Crook watched as engineers scrambled to close the gates, only to find one stubborn gate wouldn't respond. 2 divers had to plunge into the swirling pool to manually shut it. As Crook observed this chaos, a sobering thought struck him. People were risking their lives for a wild idea he had once come up with in a featureless CIA office. And things were about to get even more complicated. One of the most relentless investigative journalists in the country had started sniffing around. CIA Director William Colby, just 5 months into his role, was escorted to the Washington, D.C. bureau of the New York Times. There, the formidable reporter Seymour Hersh was waiting. Colby was under pressure. Hersh had a reputation for uncovering military and intelligence scandals. Years earlier, he'd won a Pulitzer Prize for exposing the My Lai massacre, a brutal event in which American troops slaughtered hundreds of civilians in Vietnam. Colby offered Hersh a coffee and sat down, trying to mask his nerves. He began by admitting he wanted to be frank, more frank than a CIA director typically would, but Hersh cut him off. If the director himself had come for an off-the-record talk, Sten Hersh already knew the truth. The CIA was attempting to recover a sunken Soviet submarine. Colby confessed, yes, there was a submarine. Yes, the agency was trying to bring it up. If the story ran now, it would destroy a mission that had been in the works for 6 years and cost hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars. Worse, if the Soviets got wind of it, Cold War tensions could explode. The entire mission would be scrapped, and the U.S. would have to answer for its secret actions. But Colby couldn't legally stop Hersh. He could only try to persuade him. So, he made a deal. If Hersh agreed to delay publishing the story until after the operation's completion, Colby would give him an exclusive briefing, full access to the inside story. Hersh closed his eyes, weighing the offer. Colby sat in tense silence. Finally, Hersh opened his eyes, extended his hand, and said, "You've got a deal." Colby shook his hand, barely able to hide his relief. The mission, for now, was safe. But the danger wasn't over. On August 4th, 1974, Global Marine engineer John Parsons was finally catching a few hours of sleep after being awake for more than a full day. That rest didn't last long. A panicked young crewman burst into his cabin, eyes wide, voice trembling. "John, something's wrong. We've lost a lot of weight." Parsons, a hardened former Marine with experience in Vietnam, was no stranger to high-stakes crises. He stood up, feeling the ship vibrate beneath his feet. For a second, he thought it might be an earthquake, until a far worse possibility crossed his mind. Had they lost the submarine? For over a month, the Hughes Glomar Explorer had been stationed at the K-129 wreck site. Engineers had painstakingly lowered 177,000 feet of steel pipe into the ocean, with a massive mechanical claw attached at the end. Miraculously, the claw had managed to latch on to the submarine. Slowly but surely, it was lifting the sub from the ocean floor. Everything had seemed to work exactly as the ship's designer, John Graham, had envisioned, till now. Parsons rushed to the control room. Was already packed with engineers and CIA officials staring at the live camera feed from the claw. At first glance, Parsons saw nothing wrong. The claw appeared to be intact, still cradling K-129 and ascending toward the surface. But then came a gut-wrenching realization. One of the engineers shouted, "It's not live." The camera was only set to update when a change occurred. Nothing seemed to be moving. It was probably a glitch. Technicians scrambled to reset the feed. When the image refreshed, everyone gasped. The horror had arrived. A few of the claw's fingers had snapped during the recovery, causing nearly half of the submarine to fall back into the depths of the Pacific. A large portion of K-129 now lay once again unreachable at the ocean floor. This was a crushing blow to the mission. All Parsons could do was shake his head in bitter disappointment. A pot, champagne. In Los Angeles, Curtis Crook arrived at the Project Azorian program office. It's located within one of Howard Hughes' buildings. He came in prepared to celebrate. After years of mental and emotional strain, he believed the operation had succeeded. While he had slept, he imagined the remains of K-129 were approaching the surface. After 6 grueling years of planning and tension, the moment had finally arrived. Boxes of champagne had been brought in, ready to be opened in triumph by the entire staff. But as he stepped into the office, it was immediately clear that something was wrong. The atmosphere was somber. There was no celebration, no laughter, only silence. The champagne boxes stood unopened, exactly where they had been the day before. Crook quietly placed his briefcase on his desk. One of his staff members walked in, silently spread his hands, asking without words what had happened. She simply shook her head and began to explain. Everyone had stayed late the previous night, anxiously waiting for news that K-129 had reached the surface. At 11 p.m., the first telex message came through. "Congratulations. Break out the champagne." The room erupted in cheers and embraces. But that joy was short-lived. The second message arrived minutes later. "Disregard previous communication." The claw, it turned out, had failed. A large chunk of the submarine had fallen away. 6 years of tireless work and $800 million in taxpayer money had seemingly been wasted. Though devastated, Crook held onto a thin thread of hope. The part of K-129 that remained in the claw had still contained something valuable, perhaps Soviet technology or intelligence. While the prized code books and missile systems were likely lost, they would have to wait and see what had survived. Days later, Crook was at the office when the recovery operation finally concluded. The claw had emerged through the ship's sea gates and into the moon pool of the Hughes Glomar Explorer. Once the gates were sealed and the pool drained, the crew got their first proper look at what had been retrieved. What they saw was heartbreaking. Only about a third of the submarine remained. Everything aft of the tower, most importantly, the missile compartment and the code room, was gone. It was clear that the primary targets had sunk back to the ocean floor. Crook picked up one of the champagne bottles and set it quietly on his desk. There was some achievement to acknowledge they had built a ship unlike any other, lifted part of a nuclear submarine, and kept it hidden from both the Soviets and the American public. But the result was still only partial. The champagne remained sealed. A human head. Some crew members volunteered to examine the recovered section of K-129, despite the potential risk of radiation exposure. Among them was a young CIA engineer, known for his cowlick. He followed rigorous safety protocols, surgical gloves, rubber overshoes, a full-bodied thermal suit, a Tyvek protective layer, multiple pairs of taped gloves, and an oxygen mask connected to a tank. The job was to retrieve anything of possible value: tools, equipment, even everyday items that could reveal clues about the sub's origins or the people aboard. Any item deemed remotely interesting was turned over to experts, including Russian language analysts and nuclear scientists. Volunteers had been briefed on Soviet warning symbols to avoid hazardous mistakes. But speed was essential. The recovered section had been underwater for 6 years. Corrosion was accelerating now that it was re-exposed to air. As the young engineer entered the hall, he immediately noticed the heavy scent of rust. The interior was in varying condition. Some sections were crushed as if by immense pressure, others eerily intact. In one cabin that looked like an officer's quarters, he knelt and reached beneath a bunk. Something clung to the underside. When he tugged it loose and pulled back, he was stunned. It was a human head, mostly intact. Though the eyes and ears had been consumed by sea life, the skin, hair, and even the nose remained. It had survived the abyss almost unscathed. Shaken, the engineer sat on the bunk, closed his eyes, and waited for his pulse to settle. He forced himself to look away and moved into another cabin that seemed more spacious, perhaps the captain's quarters. On the bunk lay a body, still more or less intact. At a glance, it could have been mistaken for a sleeping man. He opened a nearby drawer and found a journal. Later, CIA preservation specialists would discover the journal contained handwritten notes from a high-ranking Soviet officer, an invaluable find. The journal was flown immediately to Washington for further examination. Perhaps it would offer insights or intelligence that would justify the mission. Meanwhile, something else was happening that would change America. On that very same morning, President Richard Nixon announced his resignation amid the Watergate scandal. For Curtis Crook, it felt like two endings had collided: the downfall of the Nixon administration and the slow fade of the Azorian saga. After a month stationed above the recovery site, the Hughes Glomar Explorer finally pulled away. But the mission wasn't truly over. Everything recovered from K-129 machinery, personal effects, and that remaining third of the submarine had to be sorted, cataloged, and analyzed. Only after this exhaustive process could the operation's true value be determined. Even today, the public does not fully know what was recovered or whether the mission was worth the massive investment. What we do know is this: the operation managed to retrieve 6 human bodies. Years later, those remains were returned to Russia with a Soviet naval flag presented to President Boris Yeltsin as a gesture of respect. We also know the missiles and code books, the crown jewels of the mission, were never recovered. At least 100 feet of the submarine remains on the ocean floor, untouched. The CIA has never released a full inventory of what was pulled from K-129. Is this secrecy an attempt to cover up a wasteful failure, or are they hiding the fact that the mission actually yielded valuable information? Whatever the case, the obsession with secrecy was so intense that today, when U.S. government officials refuse to release even trivial details, the act is referred to as delivering a Glomar response. Aftermath. In the end, Project Azorian cost around $800 million, the modern equivalent of nearly $5 billion. With that kind of funding, the government could have built housing, schools, or hospitals. Instead, it was spent on one of the most expensive intelligence gambits in Cold War history. In March 1975, when journalist Seymour Hersh finally published his in the New York Times. The mission was widely seen as a failure, at least in the eyes of high-level Navy officials. Despite that, others argued it stood as a symbol of American ingenuity. After all, when Curtis Crook first sat down with John Graham to outline the project, building a ship of such magnitude seemed impossible. But they managed to construct a vessel that secretly pulled a 4-million-pound nuclear submarine from 3 miles beneath the ocean without alerting the Soviets. John Graham, the naval engineer who had once battled alcoholism, did not live to see the recovery's conclusion. Diagnosed with terminal lung cancer, he died just weeks before the retrieval. As his final wish, he asked for his ashes to be scattered aboard the Hughes Glomar Explorer, the crowning achievement of his life. Curtis Crook honored that wish alongside a small group of engineers. He took Graham's urn aboard the ship and released his ashes into the vast Pacifica, final farewell to a brilliant mind, and a quiet nod to a mission that, in spite of everything, had accomplished the impossible.